Hello. Um, it's Tuesday, sort of ish, 10ish in Redmond. And we have a light load, which is why we're not actually starting till 11. So, cool. Let's talk some API and hopefully we can continue last week's trend of only needing like half an hour. All right. We'll start with number 1290. Add resource manager try get string. Andrew.
So I'm not accustomed to going to these meetings. I'm not sure what the format is. Do I just make the case here?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So VS is a very extensible system, and we load a lot of DLLs and reflect over them, and in some cases even reach in and get resources directly out of them based on either conventions or configuration. And it's quite often during VS startup, and VS startup is for first chance exceptions. It's a sensitive issue because as developers are writing extensions for VS, they're using VS and they hit F5, we launch another copy of VS with the debugger attached. And so first chance exceptions show up, especially if they've got break on first chance exceptions as part of debugging their extension. And this resource manager.getString sometimes shows up many times during startup. And there appears to be no API to check for the existence of a resource. And preferably we'd be able to check and retrieve at the same time for perf reasons, potentially. So this is my proposed API to solve that problem.
Any specific reason for taking culture info instead of iFormat provider?
Not that I can recall from when I filed this. I'm curious what the existing API takes. I would have guessed that I just took an existing API and added try in front of it.
Yeah, the existing one takes culture, and it would probably be difficult to take iFormat provider here because presumably the default implementation here needs to call the existing one.
Yeah.
And then
Implementation of this
catch and
doesn't
return
call
false.
Yeah, we do that already. We already catch, but we
No,
don't want to throw the exception in the first place.
It's
We're trying to avoid it.
it's what would the
What
virtual
I'm
do?
thinking, Andrew, is like if someone derive like this class isn't sealed, so we have to have an implementation in try get string that at least for if this .get type does not equal type of resource manager delegates to the existing virtual.
I see.
So it would be difficult for us to take something other than culture because we'd have to somehow get a culture based on the iFormat provider.
Right. Does culture info implement iFormat provider?
It does.
It does, but you can't get a culture from an arbitrary.
Right. I was just trying to think, from our perspective, the code that we call have a culture info. And so if you took something other than a culture info, I wondered if it would be compatible with what we... So from our perspective, it would be possible as a caller, but I'm totally cool with it being culture info as well.
Sorry, I was getting distracted by apparently APIs of doesn't say virtual. So I was about to say, why do we need virtual? Because none of the things on this are virtual. So a thing for Emo's backlog. It is virtual.
Yeah.
And this seems fine. I'm curious about, I mean, not to make a decision one way or another, but I'm curious about the scale. Like, how frequently is this called with missing cultures?
Several.
Missing resources.
Several during startup, and not every startup either. I haven't figured out why. Sometimes it doesn't show up at all, and sometimes it shows up a dozen times. So this isn't a perf-driven concern. This is just hey, there's a legitimate case, presumably a legitimate case. I didn't actually write the code originally, and I don't know if there were alternatives, but I prefer that an API offer an exception-free way of coding, barring race conditions. Like you can do a file exist check before opening the file, and barring a race condition, you can avoid a file not found exception, right? We should avoid exceptions when we can, just because it's a better debugging experience, and sometimes it impacts perf. So that would be the driving force for this, not the perf one.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say if a individual resource is missing, it looks like we return null. So this
I
isn't an individual resource. This is something more complicated.
I wonder. I don't know what that means. I know we get the exception. We don't get null back. What I don't know what the difference is between an individual resource versus something else. It's get string that throws today. That sounds like an individual resource.
Well, look for a bundle. If it has a string, return it. Otherwise, fall back. If we run out of fallbacks, return null. So
I wonder if internal get resource set is what throws. Is that what you're suggesting?
But that's not that the string is missing. That's that like it couldn't find a bundle.
I don't.
So
All
I
I
think
know
that's
is
a
the
missing
exception is
language.
thrown.
I don't know.
I don't know why.
Right.
It says missing manifest resource exception, whatever that means.
Because really, this is because I would look at the try as the string doesn't exist. But
Yeah,
we already
it-
have that
it would
covered with
help.
the null.
It would help, I think, if we knew like the stack trace for the exception coming back, because then we'd know what scenario this is actually throwing an exception in.
Sure.
Because I found 5 instantiations of that exception, but I don't know which one we're talking about here.
Okay. I'm sure I could collect that, not probably during this meeting.
Yeah.
Should we table this until I have more information?
Yeah, probably because we need to understand what the try is.
So, lacking more information, I would just say as a user, try should mean get the resource if you can, don't throw otherwise. Like what this
Well, not necessarily. So try APIs often do throw exceptions in
Right.
in proper failure conditions.
I
And
agree.
yeah, and what we
Try parse on GUID could throw if you pass it a null string.
yeah,
I
exactly.
would say from my perspective as an ordinary user, I don't know the difference between a string missing from a resource versus the resource bundle. I don't even know that I don't even know what a resource bundle is. So
I'm making up words. So.
if you're going to spec, well, this is the case where we throw and this is the case where we don't, typically that should be a case that customers are familiar with.
Mhm.
Because if you're going to split hairs and say, well, this code path versus that code path, because internally we have this thing called resource bundles, I don't think that's a great story. I'd rather just see false come back.
So
Because at the end of the day, the app
the-
is going to do the same thing, right?
not necessarily. So false from these APIs generally means I can give you an answer and the answer is no. Whereas throwing an exception is like something is invalid about the state of the operation such that I can't even begin to answer your question.
Yeah, because the docs suggest that missing manifest resource exception is you opened a resource manager over a DLL that has literally no resource. Like so, it's you tried opening a non-resourced library, and it's throwing an exception of there are no resources here. What are you asking for?
Well, so that's very possible. VS loads DLLs it's never seen before or can't predict, and we just, based on configuration convention, we are looking for resources that might not be there. So if it's the case, and you say, well, we should be throwing, then my next question would be, how do we avoid the exception? What could we check on the DLL before calling getString in order to decide, oh, there's no resources here to fetch anyway?
No, and that's a good question. But I don't know if that's. I think we would need to do a little bit of experimentation offline and make sure that there's not an existing API that can give you the answer to the question you just asked.
Sure.
Because if there is an existing API for that, then we don't need to add a new API.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll get the call stack, and if I can, I'll also get details about one of the DLLs that causes this to be thrown, so that we have something to work with. And then, should I reach out to one of you between meetings to do a little bit of additional research before coming back here?
Probably it would be discussion on the issue of, and then seeing if Eric wants to bring it back as something to discuss, or if it's capable of being solved without API adjustments.
Yeah, just work on the issue. I'll see it.
Okay.
Or just reach out to me if you wanted to talk privately about something.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, because I'm looking at this, and I'm wondering if we actually need like a new API on assembly or something that tells you whether there's a resource that's legitimate.
Yeah, the intent for try APIs is really to understand what false means, right? I mean, it's okay to say, I don't know, I think we have some APIs where when you call try parse of a null string, we just return false because we couldn't parse it, right? But then there are other cases where, oh, we couldn't allocate memory, then we don't return false, we just throw, right? Because that's not a useful answer at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Because I do wonder if this will eventually come back our way. I'm just thinking that that maybe assembly might actually be the right place to surface this info rather than resource manager. But we'd have to do a little bit more investigation.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Reading chat is fun.
All right. Issue 590924, add indexer to vectors. I'm assuming Tanner?
Yep.
Okay.
So on most of our other vector types, we have indexers already. Vector 2, 3, and 4 are ones where we don't have any direct indexing support. Users have to explicitly do .x, .y, etc. on the public fields. And so people are just asking, can we have this? That way you can index by constant or non-constant, have it efficiently handled by the JIT, etc. And so we'd expose an indexer on vector 2, 3, and 4, as well as quaternion, and then a two-dimensional indexer on matrix 3x2 and 4x4. And in particular, that is row column, not column row. So that's yx, not xy, which matches how multidimensional arrays are indexed.
Row column's what I expect for a matrix, yeah.
I mean, the point really is to just allow the syntax.
Right, it's to allow indexing into these types. And then for constant inputs, the JIT can, make sure that this is not actually address taken or anything. It can just directly give you the field or generate the correct get element equivalent. And then for non-constant inputs, it would do the normal ref arithmetic and then return the right value.
I see. So you wouldn't constrain it to be constant. You would just say we can optimize when it is.
Correct. Just like we do for all the other indexers.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Because, I mean, to me, the syntax seems kind of odd because it's actually more characters than just writing out the field name for the most part.
Right. It's specifically because there's scenarios where you don't know the exact field you want. You have an index.
Right. Exactly. That's not what but in the API usage, he also uses constants, or they, I should say. I don't know whether it's a he or her.
Yeah. And then for matrix in particular, it's a lot nicer to be able to do indexing than it is to do .im11, im12, etc.
Yeah, that's true. For matrices, it's it's odd.
Tanner, quick question. Is there a concern that this might cause people to write low-performing code, such as accessing stuff within a loop, rather than just writing out sub-0, sub-1, sub-2?
When it's a in general, we should be able to optimize it in the JIT so that it's not an issue, the same as we already do with the existing vector indexers.
Okay, so even even if they're using non-constant inputs fed by like a loop iterator or something, you would expect that that would be fully optimized.
Right. And vectors in particular are special in loops in that they are one of the few places we unroll things in the JIT.
Excellent.
But if a function takes an unbounded parameter and passes it to this indexer, then a bounds check and an argument out of exception occurs.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that seems.
So does approving this API imply there's work in the JIT we have to do, or are you saying that's already kind of possible to be wired in?
All of the support's already there. I just have to basically take these new method names and then hook them up to the existing handlers.
Gotcha.
So basically, I just add in if existing check or method name equals get item.
So aren't there also other vector types that we have, like in the sort of the intrinsics? Should we do this for those as well?
They don't have indexers directly today, so potentially they have an explicit get element method and with element because they're immutable. We could have a direct indexer just for getting though.
Yeah, otherwise seems reasonable. I mean,
So it's these plus the same methods on vector 128, 64, and 256, but without the set. Is that what you're saying,
Yeah,
Nemo?
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Are we approving that now, or do you need to do more research into that?
I wouldn't need to do any more research. It's just a question on if we directly support the indexer and in addition to the explicit get element method we have today for the other ones. It sounds like everyone says that's fine.
Yeah, I have no problem pulling that along for the ride. Yeah, my only concern was whether this would cause people to maybe start typing ineffective code patterns, but I think you addressed that sufficiently. Wait, did Tanner really just suggest a new vector API that only took us like 2 minutes to review?
I mean, the vector APIs are usually easy. It's the hardware intrinsics when it comes with 400 overloads.
All right. So is that the right shape, Tanner?
It's of T and it returns T.
Okay.
And then the same for 64 and 256 and they're technically under runtime intrinsics, not numerics, but I understand the concepts.
One day GitHub will have a proper code editor for the comment box.
And I need the word int.
Yeah, just wait until someone comes back and complains this doesn't support unsigned integers or native ints.
This should be byte.
just like the intrinsics. I mean, if you wanted to follow our C style conventions, you don't have to use the word int at all.
Oh. What would our C style convention put there aside from calling it int 32t?
I think literally nothing. I think we literally just use unsigned and let the compiler reason that it's an integer.
Oh, that's because unsigned is explicit. Just the keyword unsigned is explicitly integer.
Weird.
That's actually part of the spec there. It's not one of those cases where it's like long could be blah or blah. Yeah. It's a case where unsigned int and unsigned are aliases of each other.
Kernighan and Richie really didn't like writing words. All right. 30381, add where not null to help with nullability tracking.
Yeah, I can talk to that. So
Cool.
we had a long conversation on this. So like I commented on this issue. I originally filed another one, but then this was marked as a dupe of this one here. So the general problem is that C#'s nullability engine, if you will, cannot reason about link in general, because the problem basically is that they are all independent lambdas, and the compiler has no way to understand from a flow standpoint that one value goes into the other without them special casing those scenarios. And so what ends up happening is when you use the link extension syntax, you basically get nullability checking because the compiler just checks every lambda individually effectively. So that means if you have a where clause where you say, where, and then you say x goes to x is not null, and then you say in the very next thing you say is, select, and then x dot something, then the compiler says, well, x could be null, right? Because as far as the compiler is concerned, you haven't changed the type. And so the suggestion was basically, well, if we had a dedicated where check, then this method could basically change the return type. Now, the problem with that approach, of course, is that it doesn't quite scale, right? So like, there's obviously other cases where, the null state could change. And so the concern that Stephen has is that if we allow this one, then, we basically more or less open the floodgates for, hundreds of other methods, similar to this one. Which I kind of agree with. And then there is also the other interesting situation in C#. If you use the keywords in link, when you say like from X in, and then the where keyword, and then the all of that, then they have a different way of approaching this. Then the compiler, implicitly basically types the what they call the range variables that you basically declare as your link element, if you will, as null oblivious, meaning you don't get any null checking. So the compiler doesn't do flow analysis there either. They just say, hey, we don't know whether it's null or not, so you don't get any warnings. So basically what that means is if you use the extension syntax, you get false positives. If you use the keyword syntax, you get false negatives, but you don't get actual null checking. And the compiler, there's actually a dedicated issue, which I don't have handy, but somebody filed an issue, I think, from the compiler team to effectively revisit this and do proper flow analysis, at least, for the keyword case. But I think most of us, would agree that it should also handle the delegates because they are extremely common, and it's kind of, it doesn't seem it's the right approach for us to fix it in the BCL by adding these, kind of helper methods like where not null, because it just doesn't scale, right? Because then we would also have where is null, and at some point it becomes ridiculous. Now, basically, Steve and I had some discussion on this, like how common this is. Like the problem that I have is that I run into this pretty much in all my projects because I use link quite a bit. And so for me, I actually wouldn't mind where not null. I think Roslyn also has a where not null method internally because they use it also quite frequently. And so it's just nicer to read. So I think the method would add value in and of itself. And so Stephen said, okay, then convince me by pulling some data. And so Mark Miller actually volunteered to do that. And what he did is he basically, he has some IL parser stuff. And so he basically does did analysis over all the NuGet packages. I don't know whether Mark is on the call. I don't think he is. So I'll just talk to that. So he basically pulled some numbers out of it. And so let me actually find the latest email here. So basically he has, let me get this right. I believe 3% of all the, and I think he looks at NuGet packages. So basically 3% of all the NuGet packages have, used the where extension method, and the delegate that they pass is effectively a null check. That's the 3%. Now there's different ways you can do null checks. So there's some range for it because we only checks for the super trivial null checks, but there's other ways you can do implicit null checks with different syntax. And so maybe it's between 3 to 6%. I think that was the upper boundary that he gave. And then I think he did another analysis, what percentage of assemblies use APIs from types in system link. That's about 58%. So Blink is very popular, but then when you look at the where thing, it's only 3%. So we can agree to disagree whether that's a lot or not. Like I think it is still a lot because it's 3% of everything is still a lot. But the question is whether that makes the bar for a link API, right? Because the problem is that enumerable is basically a home for, a Swiss Army knife of APIs effectively. And so the question is like, where do we draw the boundary, right? Because if we just take everything people suggest, then that's an ever-growing set. So if we say we only take things that have, 10-15% of users, then we have at least some cutoff line. And now whether it is 15% or 3% or 10%, we probably don't pull data for every single operation, but at least we can convince ourselves that we believe that's a certain number, and that would help the conversation. Stephen, did I describe that accurately?
Yeah, that was a very nice, unbiased perspective. I appreciate that. Yeah, so as Emo described, there's sort of two reasons you might want this. One is for better nullable reference type checking. I don't believe that's a good reason for us to do it. I 100% believe we should fix it, but we should fix it by fixing the compiler analysis, which will catch not just the 3% that are where x is null or x equals null, or x does not equal null rather, but we'll also catch string.is null or empty, and we'll also catch x is foo f and f dot whatever, or just x dot whatever as an instance method that would throw if it were null, and all those are things that would be caught by such a trivial method. The second case, I do understand the desire if you're doing where x to x is not null all the time. Like, I get how this might be a desirable extension method, but there are so many variations, and if it's 3 or 6%, that means 94 to 97% of wheres are for something else. That's just, to me, that doesn't meet the bar. That said, I will say, if we really believe that we would be adding this for the second case and not for the first case, then and we all believe that 3 or 6% is sufficient, then fine. I just want to make sure we're not adding it for the nullability case, because I don't believe that this is the right solution for that.
Related question, what's the bar for adding an API to queryable in addition to enumerable?
Yeah, so there's a different kind of issue that is being discussed at LDM right now. Maybe Stephen has more on that. It's this general problem of evolving expression trees, because if you look at queryable, it kind of is somewhat tied to expression trees, because the idea is that you basically construct the query at compile time and then pass it to the provider, and then they do something by walking the expression tree, right? And so the problem is when we add new methods on enumerable, we can of course add corresponding methods in queryable, but sometimes there's like problems with like new syntax in C#, for example, and the question is whether we should evolve that in general, right? So there's this general concern with us evolving, basically evolving either the expression tree shape or the operations, because if a query provider doesn't support them, then bad things will happen, right? And that's basically implementers like EF or any other OR, right? And I think the EF team is kind of pushing the C# team to just bite the bullet and do it, because it's some things become really annoying now, because you can't write normal C# code anymore because the compiler can't generate expression trees for some of the expressions.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to that, but the reason I bring it up here is because we're positing this API as like a
Right.
shorthand for a method that you might already have written, where X is not null. And
Yep.
if you're just blindly changing call sites from one to the other, and you happen to be changing a call site that originally hit a queryable select method as opposed to an enumerable select method, now all of a sudden you've significantly tanked the performance of your application, because now you're doing all of the select client side rather than server side.
Yeah, that depends on the provider. Some providers don't do the fallback; they just fail. But that is the general challenge when you use effectively things like EF, right? Because I mean, the same applies anywhere else, right? If you call a local method that you don't have mapped to some SQL Server backend method, then yeah, the compiler can't call the method, obviously, right? So it's a general concern with changing your queries, right?
I get that, but I think what I'm saying is if we don't add a method to queryable, if we leave the method only on enumerable, that's what the compiler will bind to,
Oh,
because
yeah.
iQueryable is also iNumerable. And
No,
now
I-
you've made something that appears to be an innocuous change, and you've
Yes.
completely tanked the perf of your app.
No, so that's true. So like I think the general idea is if we add a method like this to enumerable, we should add it to queryable. That I think is generally the case. I was just saying from a runtime standpoint, I mean, it wouldn't change behavior of existing programs. It's just when you evolve your queries, yes, bad things might happen, but that's more or less the problem of query rewriting in general. That's not specific to this operation.
Yeah.
So one thing, and I don't think I heard this come up, is when people are writing common filters, that means that they end up with the lambda gets turned into a function that usually gets bound into the type that doesn't get normalized across occurrences. So, if 3% of assemblies have a not equal null check, and then maybe they even have that more than once, there is something for if we add common things like where not null, then that will eliminate all of the redundant function declarations that are being generated with the lambdas.
The Roslyn compiler will dedupe across lambdas in the same assembly, so you'd only be talking at most about one per assembly.
Oh, apparently it's gotten way fancier since the last time I looked at the output.
You can't tell from just looking at ILSpy, because ILSpy will unwind it, but basically the methods end up pointing to the same method token.
Okay. Yeah, last time I looked, which was probably in like 2012, it was very naive and just generated a new one per class. Or actually per time you did it, I think. But okay, so if we've reduced that now, then would
it's
still
possible there are
have a
cases where it
reduction.
can't dedupe, but it tries hard to.
Okay. Yeah, so I think there's still a little bit of an argument, but less so given that new information.
Even if that weren't the case, though, like how much size would we possibly be talking about in the assembly compared to if you're using lambdas at all, like, and you're using link? I mean, what are we hoping to save?
I mean, every now and then you care about knocking 1 or 2 more bytes out on trimmability. So
I do when it's free, not when it's
Fair
adding
enough.
new public surface area.
Fair enough.
I mean, from the perspective, like, let's say, even if someone came and said, I have an optimization where we could add a ton of code internally, and we said, well, how many use cases would it help? It would help 3%. Like, I don't know that we would do that. Like, and now we're talking about public surface area on top of that. It also brings up an interesting question of how far would we be willing to go in optimizing this method? Because if we're adding it for perf, like, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't even have a delegate. Maybe we should have a custom iterator and then plumb that through and add all the same optimizations about special casing arrays and lists and integrating with select and all those fancy tricks we play internally for where. Are we going to duplicate all those for where not null, or is it really just calling where with a delegate?
Well, I mean, if the implementation here was just calling where with a delegate, then you've still reduced the number of not equal null lambdas potentially. But if they're getting normalized now, then
right. My point is, if we're
so.
adding it for perf reasons, then there's a whole lot more that could be done. But would we want to? Like, how far would we be willing to take that perf argument?
Yeah, I think in Link in general, I think if you really truly cared about perf, I think we would start at a different level and we would just look at the compiler being able to rewrite it to for loops, right? That would probably be the the first step, right? Rather than doing what we do currently, right? Because it's very hard for the JIT to do anything sensible. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's more like an expressiveness thing. Like if you write queries like I do, like it's just removing nulls is super common and especially annoying with value types because then you also have to do the dot value everywhere. But I mean, I personally think it would add sufficient value based on my own use, but given the data that Mark has, I mean, I'm okay with saying it doesn't make the threshold. I mean, it's a, I personally would be a little bit sad, but it's not like, I mean, it makes rational sense, right? Because, I mean, there is probably other APIs that have more applicability than this one that we would say no to, right? And so, like, we have to draw the line somewhere. So, I mean, it is a bit, as I said on the GitHub issue, what is too much and what is not enough is clearly in the eye of the beholder, right? And it's all about gut feel, right? More than anything.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in this case, as it is an extension method, there's nothing stopping someone from adding it as an extension method in their own project if they need to work around the nullability problem.
Which I have a lot, actually. So, I mean, that's the other reason why I kind of would like to stop doing that. But yes, it's a...
Well, but if we think it's... So to play both sides here to make sure we're making good decisions, if the main value comes out of nullability and we think that's a point in time problem, then we lose the argument of having had it in the BCL eventually, which means that the short-term workaround is you have it in your own assemblies. And then at some point you decide, hey, I don't need this anymore. And or that you really like reading it in words instead of in a lambda, and then you leave it, and now it's just a style preference. And if that's the primary use case, and we think we can get the compiler to fix some of the expressiveness, since I think they're the ones who really wanted the nullability analysis, then I don't think that it makes sense to have it. But yeah, I agree that really what we need is some sort of heuristic of when is something worth it on enumerable. Because at 3% of users, we would say no to everything that Tanner or I ever bring up. So it's not 3% of users; it's 3% of enumerable users. And
so let me clarify this. So, like, I mean, this is the same thought that I had. It's like we have APIs that have usage less than 3% that we think are key, right? But it's really about this. I think it's okay to say we add this API, but this API is only used by 1% of people. But it does really something that you just can't do yourself reasonably, right? Like some interop helper or some other perf critical thing that really gives you great perf without having some sort of leaky abstraction problem that causes more problems for us in the long run, right? So this one is not one of them. This is pure convenience, right? And I think for pure convenience APIs, it's probably fair to say 3% isn't enough. I think that might be a fair drawback. And then say, okay, cool. If it's a usability thing, yeah, sure, that makes sense. If it's like 80% of people use this API, then clearly that adds value, even if it doesn't do anything groundbreaking new, right? I'm not sure that 80% is the right number to have, but I mean, clearly that would be an easy decision, right? Versus 3% is more in the, I mean, it's cool when it's there, but how much does it actually do for you in practice, right? And based on the data that Mark has, it's hard to defend this as, oh, it's super common, right? it's just difficult. Now, granted, he's looked at NuGet packages, right? That's the general problem we also have is like, it might be different when you look at apps, right? Because link might not be super common in library code, but that's we don't have a huge body of apps to actually look at.
Do we know for that 3% that's applicable, how much of it would help reduce common allocations and stuff by being able to centralize the does not equal null helper?
I mean, probably not that much. I mean, given what Steven said, I mean, you would save within one assembly, right? Already, right? So it's more like you would have to have a lot of assemblies.
It's possible I'm wrong, and it's per class that it's deduped. I have to go actually look at the IL. But there is deduping that happens. So you'd be saving some number of delegates. At best one, at what best one per call site, at worst one per assembly.
Yeah, and Jared finally changed it so lambdas make singleton delegates, right?
Lambdas have created singletons as long as they don't close over anything since lambdas were introduced. At some point, anonymous methods also got on board. We still have the issue that method groups allocate every time. Even if you were to rewrite them as lambdas, they wouldn't.
Oh, right. That's right. So method groups is what the method group implicit delegate thing with the creating an object. Okay. Yeah, I knew that there was something weird we did to avoid
Yeah.
an extra delegate instantiation.
I mean, to Tanner's point with perf, like I'm also not. I mean, I'm generally not interested in arguing perf for enumerable helper methods because I feel like it just seems the wrong avenue to drive perf for this. Like I think there's like other things we should be doing that would, yield way more perf gains without introducing new APIs. Right? It would just be what the monocompiler did at some point because they lowered effectively link usage by rewriting them into for loops, right? And that seems like a more beneficial thing for us to pursue if we cared about perf. I think we generally don't think of link as a high performance access layer. Anyway, we think of it as a convenience thing, right? Or expressive or declarative way of accessing data. But if you really highly cared about perf, you would unwield it by hand into a for loop or something, right? So that's why I'm not necessarily driving this from perf, I guess.
I agree, but at the same time, this is so my questions about perf when they're for APIs this level are generally at the level of, is there something trivial we can do to help users be slightly more performant so they are not hit with death by 1,000 paper cuts when they just want to write something simple.
Right.
Also, to answer my own question, it looks like every single where x is not null, every single method gets its own static func cached.
So if you do it twice in one method, does that get deduped? But if you do it in two different methods, it creates unique ones?
1 second.
I'm not convinced that what you're seeing in the decompilation is actually reflective of what's in the IL.
So that is 100% reflective of what's in the IL. The actual method, the IL bytes are deduplicated,
right?
But the actual statics.
Oh, sure, statics. Stuff, the extra fields are going to be there.
Right. So you're going to have an allocation for each lambda. And
it's possible.
Yeah, and also yes, Jeremy,
that's are fully deduped, right?
Yeah, so the actual method bodies are, but you're going to have, and so you're going to have 3 allocations, each pointing to the same underlying, underlying method body.
I get it, but every call to where is going to allocate at least one object. Every call to where is going to allocate at least one object, if not multiple.
Right, but I was asking this from the perspective of, we could then cache the where not null to be a single delegate, so that anyone using where not null shares the allocation.
Yeah. So we save,
which is example, a small
we save amount. 2 delegate allocations for the lifetime of the application.
Right, and as somebody pointed out in chat, we're really even talking about per T. So now it's how many times are people actually using the same T?
Yeah, this is not an interesting discussion to me. I mean, yeah. If we're talking about improving the efficacy of an existing method, great. If we're talking about adding a new overload that would implicitly bind, maybe. We're talking about adding a brand new method to save 2 delegate allocations or 1 delegate allocation per use for the lifetime of the process. That's nothing.
Yeah, I withdraw my perf argument since it can't. I mean, we could probably get things to do very clever things with reusing the same object-based thing, so it's literally the same delegate, but I don't think we would ever think that was worth it.
Well, that's actually automatic for reference type T. It's just for value type T that you get unique.
You still get different fields for reference types. You still get a different delegate allocation.
Right.
Yeah, they would get the same.
That part we would have to optimize.
But it's going to basically generate a different function of some other type pointing to some other thing. So if you got that delegate and asked it what the input type was, it's different. So there's a different object per T.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, to me, like if if we can get small perf gains on existing code that is used a lot, it makes sense, right? Otherwise, it's more like, okay, we can add this new API that does something minor, but we know that we call it heavily internally, and then this is how the benefit gets to the customer. That's also fine. But if it's basically every customer in the world would have to opt into this to get these minor gains, it doesn't seem worth it. Yeah.
I think I've moved into the position of not worth the IL.
Yeah, to me it's borderline. Like I can see both sides, so I'm kind of curious what other people think. I would certainly use it.
I mean, we wouldn't be having this discussion if it weren't for the nullability thing, right? Like, we're basically trying to convince ourselves that the perf argument is enough so that the people get this nice nullability helper. So if you were to write your own extension method for this, like, you'd have to do like either a suppression on aware, right, or you would just do your own generator.
No, I mean, like,
Yeah.
if you look at the implementation of it, it's trivial because you basically, if you write the extension method yourself, you just declare them like they are, and the compiler will actually help you to get that correct. You don't have to suppress anything in there because in the context of the method body, the compiler can see you take something nullable, you do a null check, and you only return it when it's not null.
If you do a generator method. I don't know if like the link stuff, because it like news up its own iterator or something, is any better.
It's probably
Yeah, they're all
not necessarily, yeah.
they're all struct-based iterators in retail builds.
Yeah, but the struct-based iterator doesn't matter too much because everything's returning an interface. This is the whole. That's the whole thing of like, there's low-level people who want every like method to actually return a T enumerable where T enumerable is I enumerable. That way you could actually have zero cost link.
Fun times.
Zero-ish, right? Like there's still
Well,
probably some overhead.
for a value type T, it allows the JIT to fully optimize inline, etc. Remove boxing, etc. Otherwise, it's subject to, if this method call happens to be inlined and the IEnumerable was a directly boxed value type, then it can optimize. So it's a guarantee versus a hand wavy if.
So what you're saying is we should add a new link type that does all of that.
Yeah, there's proposals for value link. I don't know how feasible that actually is, and there'd be generic bloat and cross-gen issues, and Jan would probably go, we should move this out of corelib or similar.
Yeah, I mean, to Steven's point, like or Stefan, I should say, like I probably have had aware not null before the nullability thing, but I would agree with you that my urge of fighting the bug has significantly raised due to that. So if that would disappear, probably my urge would also go down. That's probably fair. And I'm pretty sure that's also generally what I see on people when they complain about the lack of this method.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we would add a new thing for Net 7, it'll be in a Net 7 plus TFM. So now people need to be moved to Net 7. They need to rewrite their code. They need to do these, like, I think we would go from 3% of people have not equal null to 3% of people have not equal null, and 0.001% of people are using this. So I think that this is, we would be doing it to feel good about ourselves, but it would have no customers. So I think no.
I mean, since Jared joined the call, I mean, I would also say, like, to Steven's earlier point, I think it puts pressure on the right part of the system, right? Because if we keep adding these duct tape things everywhere, that's also probably not the right thing in the long run. It's better if enough people complain to the compiler team and say, hey, give me proper flow analysis here.
Yep. Jared's being awfully quiet. So,
Thinking of a great dad joke to drop on us.
yeah.
Jared's still stuck on the missing manifest exceptions.
So I did find out what's causing it and what VS is already doing to try to avoid it, and where we seem to feel like we've hit the wall.
Yeah, can we
If you-
first
if you
close
have
on
time
this
to
one
do it.
here? Yeah, let's close on this one here.
Yeah,
which
go ahead.
I think more or less everybody seems to be leaning towards no. So is there anybody else who wants it and hasn't said anything yet? Otherwise, you should just close it. Going, gone.
Gone.
Nice. All right. So then let's back to the resource manager thing now that Andrew
If you
has
want to come
already
back
said-
to it. If you, basically, we're given the name of an individual resource, but not the name of the resource bundle or the resource embedded stream. So we have 5 or 6 resource stream names that we try. And we actually check, okay, well, does this one exist in the assembly? No. Does this one exist in the assembly? No. But after we fail to find anything in the assembly, we actually pick 1 or 2 common ones and try anyway, because .NET might find it in a satellite assembly, and we were only searching the primary assembly. So is there a way, so the way we do that is we create a resource manager as if the resource existed, and then we try to retrieve the resource from it, and then it throws. So is there a way to tell, might a resource exist in the appropriately loaded satellite assembly without throwing?
Or is there a way more generally we could expose something that would allow you to avoid doing that whole search?
Oh, that'd be lovely, yes. You're trying to solve the whole problem again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was part of the point of what would the try get string be doing, is if you have a broader scenario with a better question, we might come up with a better function.
I just want to say I really love Andrew's background. Unrelated, but very important.
Yeah. I mean, it is a little weird because there's no chair there.
True.
Oh my god, you do not have any uniform. that makes me super jealous now.
I got this with our morale budget money a year or 2 ago.
That is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I have a comm badge from Renegade somewhere.
I haven't worn it all summer because it's long sleeve, right? I mean, it's not good for the summertime, but in the winter, it's good.
Oh, and you made yourself a captain.
I think
Or first officer. I think they have more pins as well.
But one would be hollow.
Okay.
I think my favorite thing about it is how you put it on. There's no back apparently; it's just the front.
Yeah, it's a zipper in the back, so unless I zip, it's kind of loose.
If you ever want to see something funny, see the making of from TNG. When you see how they get into the uniforms, it looks kind of it looks very weird. It doesn't look as cool as it looks on the show.
They're basically poured into them or something.
Yeah, so Gene Roddenberry apparently had the goal and says uniforms of the future don't have any sort of wrinkles, and so they designed the uniforms to be wrinkle-free on show, but that makes them super weird to get in and out of. So anyway, talking about wrinkles. So
yeah.
Looks
So
like go ahead.
I was gonna say I don't know that we would know off the top of our head what the right answer for that is. I think it'll be a discussion with Eric and Tadek.
Okay. All right. We'll continue the discussion on GitHub and come back with a proposal if we need one.
It's absolutely worth solving, definitely.
Cool. Thanks.
yeah, it seems everybody seems to agree with that. So that's good. Now it's just what's the right shape of the API, but I think once you have figured it out, we can probably approve it.
Yeah, but in particular, I don't think that try get string will be the right answer because the naive interpretation, like looking at it, what I would assume is it returns false if the resource is not found, but the exception represents you're asking a question that makes no sense. Like you open this DLL and this is crypt32 DLL. Like there are no .NET resources in this. What are you even trying to do? And So we would need resource manager dot found resource bundle as a property or something to answer the question differently. Cool.
Yeah, because as written, like looking at your call stack, it's not actually calling get string, it's calling get object, and so we would need try get object, try get string, etc. Where if we lifted it to a different thing, like Jeremy just suggested, you wouldn't need the try on all the different get methods.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it would be the thing that would give you the resource manager that we would try rather.
Or a method on resource manager that says tell me what assembly you found for this culture, and it can return null for neither the main thing nor a satellite assembly was found, or something somewhere else that we're asking, like, are resources even available for the scope that I've asked, as opposed to get string or get object, which is give me this resource as a string.
Right. Considering that there's 3 candidates, there's the main assembly, the default satellite assembly, and the preferred satellite assembly. In fact, maybe 4. Like, there's a whole fallback path of assemblies. So I don't know that I want which assembly did you find it from, as much as given this resource name, can you find it in any of those assemblies?
This whole infrastructure is pluggable too, and people do extend it to be backed by things that aren't even assemblies at all. Like, I believe paint.net uses data files, and all the same APIs return the resources. So there's another layer in there that you have to feed.
Yeah, and maybe the answer is a constructor parameter to resource manager, which is ignore missing resource bundles or something. So then you just get null. I like it. So it would be starting from the scenario and then seeing where meet in the middle comes up with what the API should be. But I think that's an offline discussion. So.
Sorry,
Right.
that mode switch would be lovable to null annotate though. Like that, it's like, oh, we don't return null unless you set this property.
No, because right now it returns null. So if you have if you open a resource manager for an assembly that does have some resources, and you ask for a resource name, which is not a resource in that resource set, then it will return null. The thing that the default resource manager is doing right now is throwing, there don't seem to be any resources, what are you trying to do here?
Yeah, you're basically just extending the set, the number of cases we return null, which you already do, so it wouldn't change the annotations.
Right, which is why that was the maybe it's a Boolean.
I like the idea that
Eric's, not all resource managers are backed by assembly, so we can't have the question at resource manager, at least not on the instance. So.
Well, you could on a constructor. If you added a constructor that an overload that takes the assembly like your existing constructor does, but then an optional bool that says ignore missing resource bundles.
Right, because then we know we're using the assembly-based resource resolver,
right,
and we've told it to be in a different mode, as opposed to a property on resource manager of where was the assembly, and then paint.net with their resource bundle says this doesn't make any sense. So
I gotta run, and taking a lot of your time. Thank you very much. I'll continue the conversation on GitHub.
Live long and prosper. All right. So with that level of geekiness, I observe.
Please conclude the meeting in Klingon now, or Vulcan.
That we are out of time, and so I will conclude the meeting in the closest that I can get to Klingon, which is angry German. Das ist alles. Tschüss.
Bye.
Auf Wiederschauen.